A mother's scream shattered the silence of a January morning in 2010. After 3 agonizing months of searching, praying, and clinging to hope, Gil Harrington's worst nightmare became reality when police confirmed the remains found on a remote farm belonged to her daughter Morgan. But this story doesn't begin with that devastating discovery. It begins on what should have been a perfect night, October 17, 2009. 20-year-old Morgan Harrington, full of life and excited to see Metallica perform, made one fatal mistake. She stepped outside the arena during the concert and couldn't get back in due to a strict no re-entry policy. At 8:48 p.m., she called her friends, telling them not to worry, that she'd find her own way home. Those were the last words they would ever hear from her. What followed was a parent's worst nightmare stretched across 5.5 years. A case that went cold despite massive search efforts, FBI involvement, and desperate pleas from Metallica themselves. A family torn apart by unanswered questions. A community haunted by the knowledge that a killer walked free among them. The truth, when it finally emerged, would reveal something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Don't let the resolution of Morgan Harrington's cold case fade into silence. Subscribe now to uncover the shocking truth behind how justice was finally served. Ignore this, and you'll be turning your back on the hard-fought justice. Subscribe now, unless you're okay with letting the truth go unnoticed. Before that October night changed everything, Morgan Dana Harrington was living the kind of life every parent dreams their child will have. At 20 years old, she possessed the rare combination of intelligence and compassion that made everyone around her feel special. Her friends at Virginia Tech knew her as the girl who would drop everything to help a struggling classmate. Her professors recognized her natural gift with children. She was majoring in elementary education because she genuinely believed she could change young lives, one student at a time. But Morgan's heart extended far beyond the classroom walls. While most college students spent their breaks relaxing, Morgan packed her bags for Brazil, volunteering on a medical mission to help children who had nothing. She came home with stories that made her parents' hearts swell with pride, not because of what she had accomplished, but because of who she had become. Dan and Gil Harrington had raised their daughter to see the world as a place worth improving. They watched her grow from a curious little girl into a young woman who radiated warmth and possibility. Sunday dinners at the Harrington home were filled with Morgan's laughter, her plans for the future, her excitement about the children she would one day teach. She talked about opening her own classroom, about making learning an adventure, about being the teacher who never gave up on a child. Her room was filled with education textbooks, alongside concert posters. She loved music as much as she loved learning. Morgan was the daughter who called her parents just to check in, who never forgot a birthday, who made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She had inherited her mother's strength and her father's gentle spirit, creating a combination that made her impossible not to love. Morgan was building something beautiful, a life dedicated to service, surrounded by people who adored her, filled with dreams that seemed within reach. She had already been accepted for student teaching, had picked out the decorations for her future classroom, had even started a collection of children's books she planned to read to her students. Everything about Morgan suggested a future filled with wedding bells, grandchildren for Dan and Gil, decades of impact on countless young minds, and the kind of legacy that makes a parent's sacrifices worthwhile. She had no idea that everything she had built, everything she planned, everything she dreamed of, would end with a single decision to step outside an arena on a Saturday night. But to understand how a life so full of promise could be destroyed so completely, you have to know what really happened on October 17, 2009, and why that night would haunt a community for years to come. October 17, 2009, began like any other Saturday that would live forever in a parent's memory. except this one would become their worst nightmare. Morgan was electric with excitement. She had been looking forward to this Metallica concert for weeks, and the energy was contagious as she and her 3 closest friends piled into the car for the drive to Charlottesville. The John Paul Jones Arena was packed with thousands of fans, and Morgan was exactly where she wanted to be. Surrounded by friends, listening to music she loved, living the carefree life of a 20-year-old with everything ahead of her. The opening act was loud, the crowd was wild, and Morgan was having the time of her life. She was laughing with her friends, singing along, completely absorbed in the moment. Nothing about that evening suggested it would be anything other than another great memory to add to her collection. Then nature called. It was such an ordinary decision, Morgan needed to use the restroom. She told her friends she'd be right back, squeezed through the crowd and stepped outside the arena. What she didn't know was that the University of Virginia had a strict no re-entry policy. Once you left, you were locked out. No exceptions, no matter how desperately you begged. Standing outside in the cool October air, Morgan realized she was trapped. Her friends were inside enjoying the main act. Metallica had just taken the stage, and she was stuck outside with no way back in. But Morgan was resourceful, optimistic, the kind of person who believed every problem had a solution. At exactly 8:48 p.m., her phone rang in her friend's pocket inside the arena. Morgan's voice was calm, reassuring even. "Don't worry about me," she told them. "I'll find my own way home. I'll see you later." Her friends, caught up in the concert, trusted that Morgan would figure it out. She always did. But Morgan didn't go home. At 9:30 p.m., witnesses spotted a young blonde woman on the Copley Bridge, just outside the arena. She was alone, thumb extended, trying to catch a ride with strangers. The witnesses later described her as appearing distressed but determined. Cars passed by in the darkness, some slowed down, some stopped. Then she was gone. The next morning, when Morgan's friends woke up, expecting to rehash the concert over coffee, they found only silence. No text messages, no missed calls, no Morgan. By Sunday afternoon, a groundskeeper was making his routine walk through the athletic complex near the arena when something caught his eye in a nearby field. Morgan's black purse lay abandoned in the grass, its contents scattered. Her ID was there, her credit cards were there, but her cell phone, the phone that had carried her last words to her friends, was there too, with one detail that made investigators' blood run cold. The battery had been deliberately removed from the phone, ensuring that no one could trace its location or hear Morgan's final moments. What happened to Morgan Harrington between 9:30 p.m. on that bridge and the discovery of her purse the next day would remain a mystery that would torment her family and challenge investigators for years, until the truth revealed something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. When parents lose a child, they're supposed to have a body to bury, answers to their questions, and closure to begin healing. Dan and Gil Harrington had none of these things. Only a growing certainty that their daughter was never coming home. The search for Morgan consumed every waking moment of their lives. While other families gathered for Thanksgiving dinner, the Harringtons were printing missing person flyers. While other parents celebrated Christmas morning, Dan and Gil were driving through rural Virginia, checking every abandoned building, every wooded area, every place their daughter might be waiting for rescue. They created a website that became their lifeline to hope. They conducted interview after interview, their voices growing hoarse from repeating Morgan's description, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent wondering if she was cold, hungry, or calling for them. The media coverage was extensive. Morgan's face appeared on news broadcasts across the nation. Even Metallica, the band Morgan had disappeared trying to see, released an emotional video plea asking the public for help finding her. But weeks turned into months, and the silence grew deafening. The breakthrough everyone prayed for came on January 26, 2010, in the most heartbreaking way possible. A farmer walking his property in Albemarle County, about 10 miles from the arena, discovered what appeared to be human remains scattered across a remote field. The call that every parent of a missing child dreads finally came. Morgan had been found, but not the way anyone wanted. The autopsy confirmed what her family already knew in their hearts. Morgan had been murdered. But the cause of death remained sealed, another piece of information locked away in an investigation that seemed to raise more questions than answers. The FBI joined the case, bringing their vast resources and expertise to bear on what had become one of Virginia's most high-profile unsolved murders. Agents combed through evidence, interviewed witnesses, and followed every lead, no matter how small. The community rallied around the investigation, with volunteers dedicating countless hours to helping search for clues that might bring Morgan's killer to justice. Yet for 2 years, the case remained frozen in frustration. Then, in 2012, the FBI made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Forensic evidence had linked Morgan's murder to an unsolved sexual assault that had occurred in Fairfax, Virginia, 7 years earlier in 2005. Suddenly, Morgan's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was connected to another violent crime, suggesting they were hunting a predator who had struck before. A sketch of the suspect was released to the public, the face of the man who might have answers to the questions that haunted the Harrington family. Tips poured in, but none led to an arrest. The sketch hung in police stations and was shared thousands of times online, but the man it depicted seemed to have vanished as completely as Morgan had. Dan and Gil Harrington refused to let their daughter's case fade into the cold case files. They spoke at conferences, lobbied for legislative changes, and kept Morgan's story alive in the media. Their pain became their purpose, but the questions that tortured them remained unanswered. Who killed their daughter? Why? And would he strike again? They didn't know that somewhere in Charlottesville, the man whose face stared back from those FBI sketches was living a normal life, working a regular job and waiting for the perfect moment to destroy another family. The answer to their prayers would come from the most unexpected place. Another family's nightmare that would finally expose the monster who had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. September 13th, 2014. 5 years after Morgan Harrington vanished, another young woman was about to walk into the same deadly trap, and this time, the predator would finally make the mistake that would expose him. Hannah Graham was everything Morgan had been, bright, beautiful, and full of promise. The 18-year-old University of Virginia sophomore had her whole life mapped out ahead of her. She was pre-med, determined to become a doctor, the kind of student who made her parents burst with pride every time they talked about her future. On that Friday night, she was doing what college students do, meeting friends for drinks in downtown Charlottesville's bustling entertainment district. But Hannah never made it to her destination. Security cameras captured her final movements in a series of haunting images that would later become crucial evidence. She was seen walking alone down the downtown mall around 1:20 a.m., appearing disoriented and vulnerable. The footage showed her stumbling slightly, clearly having had too much to drink, the perfect target for someone watching and waiting. What those cameras also captured was terrifying. A large man following Hannah, matching her pace, closing the distance between them with predatory precision. The man appeared to approach her, and then both figures disappeared into the darkness, beyond the camera's reach. Hannah's friends woke up Saturday morning to discover she had never come home. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her bed hadn't been slept in. The all-too-familiar nightmare of a missing college student began again. But this time, investigators had something they hadn't possessed 5 years earlier: clear surveillance footage of a suspect. The search for Hannah Graham mobilized the entire University of Virginia community. Thousands of volunteers combed through woods, fields, and abandoned buildings. Her parents, John and Susan Graham, made desperate television appeals, their voices breaking as they begged for their daughter's safe return. The similarities to Morgan Harrington's case were impossible to ignore. Another young woman, another night out, another family plunged into hell. Police released the surveillance footage to the public, and the response was immediate. Tips flooded in, identifying the man who had been following Hannah as Jesse Matthew Jr., a 32-year-old former cab driver who worked as a patient technician at the University of Virginia Medical Center. He had access to vulnerable people, a clean public reputation, and had been hiding in plain sight for years. When police moved to arrest Matthew, he fled. A manhunt ensued that stretched from Virginia to Texas, where he was finally captured on a beach, trying to disappear, just as he had made his victims disappear. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As forensic experts began analyzing evidence from Hannah's case, they made a discovery that sent electricity through the investigation. DNA evidence collected from Jesse Matthew Jr. matched forensic evidence from Morgan Harrington's murder case. The same DNA that had linked Morgan's death to the 2005 Fairfax sexual assault now had a name and a face. The moment investigators had that match, 5 years of frustration, dead ends, and sleepless nights suddenly made sense. The man who had destroyed the Graham family was the same monster who had torn apart the Harringtons. The predator who had been hiding in Charlottesville wasn't a stranger passing through. He was a resident, someone who lived and worked in the community, someone who had been selecting victims and striking when the opportunity arose. Dan and Gil Harrington received the phone call they had been waiting for since 2009. The man who killed their daughter finally had a name: Jesse Matthew Jr. But as investigators began examining Matthew's background, they discovered that Morgan and Hannah weren't his only victims. They were simply the ones whose cases had finally connected the dots on a pattern of violence that stretched back nearly a decade. The arrest of Jesse Matthew Jr. would reveal the terrifying truth about how a serial predator had operated undetected for years, and how many lives he had destroyed before justice finally caught up with him. Do you think justice was finally within reach? Share this video if you believe the truth always finds a way. The man who had terrorized families for nearly a decade looked nothing like the monster everyone expected him to be. Jesse Matthew Jr. was the kind of person you'd trust with your life. As a patient technician at the University of Virginia Medical Center, he had access to the most vulnerable people in the community. Patients who were unconscious, elderly, or too sick to protect themselves. Colleagues described him as friendly, helpful, someone who seemed genuinely caring. Parents felt comfortable with him around their children. Women felt safe in his presence. It was the perfect disguise for a predator. As investigators dug deeper into Matthew's background, a chilling pattern emerged that explained how he had evaded capture for so long. The 2005 Fairfax sexual assault that had been forensically linked to Morgan's murder wasn't his first crime. It was simply the first time he had left evidence behind. Matthew had been perfecting his methods, learning from each attack, becoming more careful with each victim. But the most terrifying discovery was how he selected his targets. Matthew wasn't a random killer, striking whenever opportunity arose. He was methodical, patient, studying his victims before he struck. He had worked as a cab driver, giving him access to intoxicated women who needed rides home. He frequented the same entertainment districts where college students gathered. He knew exactly where to find vulnerable young women, and he knew exactly how to approach them without raising suspicion. When police finally tracked Matthew to that Texas beach, the arrest sent shockwaves through the Charlottesville community. Neighbors who had lived next to him for years couldn't believe the friendly man they knew was capable of such violence. Co-workers who had trusted him with their most vulnerable patients felt sick knowing what he had been doing in his spare time. The University of Virginia Medical Center immediately launched an investigation into whether Matthew had attacked patients under his care. The cab company that had employed him began reviewing complaints from female passengers who had felt uncomfortable during rides. Every interaction Matthew had ever had with a woman became suspect. For the families of Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. Finally, they had answers about who had destroyed their daughters. But those answers came with the horrifying realization of how close Matthew had come to striking again, and how many other families might have suffered if Hannah's case hadn't finally exposed him. What investigators discovered next would reveal that Matthew's reign of terror had been even longer and more devastating than anyone had imagined, and that Morgan and Hannah were just two names on a list of victims that stretched back over a decade. But even with Matthew behind bars, the fight for justice was far from over, and the legal battle that followed would test every family involved in ways they never expected. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Gil Harrington's quiet weeping as she prepared to face her daughter's killer for the first time. March 2, 2016. Nearly 6.5 years after Morgan disappeared, Jesse Matthew Jr. stood before a judge, finally ready to confess to the crimes that had destroyed 2 families and terrorized a community. But the path to this moment had been filled with agonizing decisions that would haunt everyone involved. The prosecution had a strong case against Matthew. DNA evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony. They could have pursued the death penalty, giving the families the ultimate justice for their daughter's murders. But there was a problem. Matthew's defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence, potentially dragging both families through years of appeals, retrials, and endless courtroom battles that could re-traumatize them over and over again. Dan and Gil Harrington faced an impossible choice. They could demand Matthew's execution and risk years of legal delays that might never result in justice, or they could accept a plea deal that would guarantee he would never hurt another family, but would spare his life. The decision tore at their hearts, but ultimately, they chose certainty over revenge. Standing before Judge Cheryl Higgins, Matthew spoke words that the Harrington family had waited over 6 years to hear. Guilty. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Morgan's case, and first-degree murder in Hannah Graham's case. No elaborate explanations, no attempts to justify his actions. Just a simple admission of the evil he had committed. The judge's sentence was swift and final. 4 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. Matthew would die in prison, never again having the opportunity to destroy another family, never again walking free among the innocent people he had spent years hunting. For Dan and Gil Harrington, the moment brought a complex mixture of relief and continued grief. Justice had finally been served, but it couldn't bring Morgan back. It couldn't erase the years of sleepless nights, the constant wondering, the pain that had become as much a part of their daily lives as breathing. Gil Harrington later described the plea deal as giving them a measure of peace. They no longer had to wonder if Morgan's killer would escape justice. They no longer had to fear that he might hurt another family. The monster who had taken their daughter was locked away forever. But even as they walked out of that courtroom, knowing Matthew would never be free again, they carried the weight of knowing that justice, no matter how complete, could never truly heal the wound left by losing a child. What the Harrington family didn't know was that their fight for justice was about to become something much larger. A mission that would honor Morgan's memory and potentially save countless other families from experiencing their nightmare. The end of Matthew's trial marked the beginning of a new chapter in Morgan's story, one that would transform her tragic death into a powerful force for protecting other young women. What are your thoughts on plea deals and justice? Leave your opinion in the comments. Do you think it was the right choice? Some people change the world through their life. Morgan Harrington changed it through her death. Dan and Gil Harrington could have retreated into their grief, spending their remaining years mourning what was taken from them. Instead, they made a choice that transformed their daughter's murder into a mission that has saved lives across the country. They created the Help Save the Next Girl Foundation, a name that captures everything Morgan represented and everything her parents refused to let die with her. The foundation travels to college campuses nationwide, teaching young women the situational awareness skills that could mean the difference between life and death. They share Morgan's story not to frighten, but to empower, showing students how to recognize danger, trust their instincts, and protect themselves from predators who rely on vulnerability and isolation. Through their foundation, Dan and Gil have spoken to hundreds of thousands of young women, parents, and law enforcement officers. They've influenced safety policies at universities, pushed for legislative changes that protect victims, and created a network of awareness that extends far beyond Virginia. Morgan's dream was to teach children and make the world safer for them. Her parents have ensured that dream lives on, protecting countless daughters from experiencing what their family endured. Don't let Morgan Harrington's sacrifice fade into silence. Subscribe now to support awareness that saves lives. Ignore this, and you're turning your back on the protection her story provides. Subscribe now, unless you're okay with letting another family suffer in darkness.